Hi, I'm Aidan Dowdall, and this is The Edge, where we will be answering many questions involving problems that may relate to your life. As many of you may know, marijuana is a very controversial topic that many students may encounter during their time. Today, I'm visited by Mr. Eric Birkhimer, who is a recovered addict and now currently working as an interventionalist, and we will be discussing the negative effects of teenage marijuana usage on their educational and social life. So, Mr. Burkheimers, we discussed earlier before the show that you first encountered marijuana when you were 13 years old. So, who or how did you get introduced into drugs?
My introduction to drugs was, more of it was, part of my neighborhood, throughout my growing up process, middle school, marijuana, alcohol were the first things I was introduced to, and it was really just a group of friends, that I grew up with since the time I was a little guy, and a couple people had started it, and I think it was more of me doing it, really just to be part of.
Building into that, why do you think that marijuana is so appealing to teenagers today?
I think a lot of it has to do with, kind of the piggyback off the part of for me was, kids, I think, growing up, want acceptance. And, in my experience of going through middle school and high school, there's a lot of segregation, within the school, different groups. And, it's kind of like, wherever you can get in, just to feel a part of that group, you kind of compromise yourself and do some of the things that you might not have done just for that acceptance of that group.
Okay. I have substance abuse among 12th graders is down 8.3% from 1996 to 2017. Now, how big of a problem do you think it is today from back then? Do you still view it as a major problem?
Well, I definitely, personally, feel like it's a problem. I would love to maybe see some statistics on, maybe the harder drugs kind of moving into the schools, if it's taking precedence over marijuana, the access of harder drugs becoming more prevalent in our communities. That's the scary thing.
Mm-hmm. Now, what would you say in your personal life marijuana what would you say any negative effects it had on your social and educational life?
Marijuana, in middle school it was very sporadic, kind of like a weekend thing. By the time I was a freshman in high school, it was a daily occurrence. I definitely believe that it had a huge impact on my athletic drive. I would show up for games, but I wasn't a big practicer. So, in a lot of ways I was an underachiever in athletics. I started also throughout my high school career to notice that there was becoming a division between two groups of my friends. I had a group on one side that did alcohol and drugs, and then I had another group that were kind of like growing out of the experimental phase and, pursuing careers and, excelling in things, and I started to, take the turn for the worst.
People who begin using marijuana under the age of 18 are 4 times more likely to become dependent on marijuana. Now, do you think this played a part in you?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
How long would you say you smoked marijuana from when you started at 13 years old until when you stopped?
Probably not an exact date, but I would probably say I smoked marijuana up until 23. The age of 23 on a daily occurrence. By that time, harder drugs had become a bigger part of my life. So it almost, marijuana was almost phased out, by, more harmful drugs.
Was that, when you were 23, was that the first time you attempted to stop, or have you been trying throughout all those years and were unable to?
Well, I don't think there was ever, by the way I view the word attempt, an honest attempt. Marijuana, for me, really just got pushed to the back burner as more harmful substances became more important, in my view. There was more of an attempt at, getting rid of the habits with those down the road. But I really can't say that marijuana, that I attempted to quit.
How would you, if you would give any advice to parents today who has a teenage son or daughter who smokes marijuana, what advice would you give to them to help confront this problem?
I would use the advice that my parents would use. My parents did the best they could with what they knew, and I believe education today for parents on healthy boundaries, making it difficult for your loved ones to engage in those behaviors, holding your loved ones accountable. Leverage is a big deal when you're trying to help families, get their loved ones to see the light of day, that this is a problem. So, there's various entities out there that, teach boundaries, healthy boundaries, from a parent to a potential addict's perspective. And I would encourage them to start that at a very early age.
Did any of your friends during the time do anything to try to prevent you from something bad happening, or did they really just not think of it as a big deal?
Of course, yeah. I've had a lot of friends that are still, thankfully, my friends today. A lot of my friends loved me from a distance, encouraged me, to do things differently. But yeah, of course, I've always had good guidance around me. Was always very poor at making good decisions for myself.
What advice would you give to any teenagers today who know their friend may have a problem, and what advice would you give to them to help them confront their friend about it?
Communication. Secrets hurt people. Walk through the fear of having a confrontation with your friend. It's better to have a confrontation with someone that you care about rather than not say anything for fear they're going to get upset with you.
Do you think that it's hard for teenagers to stop using marijuana once they become dependent on it?
I do. I think there's so many factors that play into it. Not only from a peer pressure perspective to an acceptance perspective, but the addictive component. It becomes such a routine, such a way of life. Your mind is almost conformed to this reality that you can't go about your life without it. And at the end of the day, it's a lie, but it's a very strong lie that lies in the minds of, addicted people.
Now, a student, if they have a problem with marijuana usage and they know they do, and they want to get help, they may be uncomfortable talking to their parents about it because they don't want anybody to know. So what would you suggest they do at that time?
Well, there's with technology today, there's so many platforms out there that someone could reach out to. There's chat rooms that people can get into just to, start the discussion. There's pastors. There's 12-step groups. Something that just in my experience over the past 2 decades, I've really seen, especially with my reestablishment back into the Pittsburgh and West Virginia communities, is the stigma of the addicted person has really gotten a lot better in terms of people just feeling comfortable just to say, hey, I have a problem, and not being looked down at or shunned. So it's going to be an individual comfort level, but there's all different avenues you could take, to reach out for help. Doesn't necessarily have to be mom and dad at first.
And out of all of those avenues that you just spoke of, what do you believe would be the first and most effective step to take?
Well, I think, again, if an individual is contemplating whether they have a problem, there's all varying degrees of what we identify as a problem. But the first step is to speak about it and to speak out loud about it.
How would you say that teenagers should avoid marijuana? Is it mostly just peer pressure to get away from their source or whoever's they're around that is using it, or what would you say is the way for them to avoid it?
Well, it's such a complex question, and reflect all the time. I wish I had a, one-size-fit-all answer for that question. I would, I use my personal experience from a perspective that I would have never thought that simple experimentation in middle school with marijuana would have taken me to a place of being 29 years old, homeless, evicted, and had no one else to blame but myself and my decisions. I would encourage people to really take to heart, because all of us, in one way or another, have seen addiction near and far. And I would encourage people to attempt to take the attitude that it can happen to you. This thing doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about how much money you have, about the clothes that you wear, about your economic background, your cultural background. I've seen it happen to all different types of people. So just have the attitude that, the more you play around with it, the more you're giving rise to the potential of it taking you places you would have never dreamed of.
Who would you say that inspired you to completely drop drugs, including marijuana?
One of my first attempts, and I grew up in a good household, mother, father, both, still married 40 years later, put them through a lot. And for whatever reason, they were never able to get through to me. And at age 25, I remember being in a treatment facility, and there was a man that had one leg, and he was in a wheelchair, and he was of Indian descent. And so that man started getting me to think in a different light that I'd ever thought. I listened to him. He's deceased now, but that was probably the first man that inspired me that and provided me just a glimmer of hope that I could have a life without alcohol and drugs.
How does the school, the person's school, react to if they find out somebody smokes marijuana?
Well, I would encourage, my opinion would be, instead of, there has to be accountability. Most schools I would think have a zero tolerance policy, and you have to abide by that. I would also encourage schools to, side on the error of treatment. I've seen treatment work in all different various ways. Even if that means, giving up a semester. Sometimes 30, 60, 90 days of treatment might be the difference in someone's future. So in a short version, I would encourage treatment rather than punishment for most people. But, with addiction, a lot of times you have the drug use compounded with other behaviors, and that's what makes it a little bit difficult.
How did your family in particular react when they first found out about marijuana usage?
Marijuana usage, I think the marijuana usage itself really didn't concern them as much as some of the things that followed. I think a lot of at that time, which was late '90s, early 2000s, I think there was some public embarrassment. I think there was a level within both of my parents of really just not knowing what to do. And they would probably say the same thing. I think for years they tried to love me into recovery, and the way they did that was actually hurting me.
So, like you said before, with the schools, you said more of treatment than punishment. Mm-hmm. Would you apply that to parents as well?
I would. I mean, and again, you're going to have all different types of circumstances, and some circumstances are going to require, some firm accountability. But I would always, compound that with some form of treatment. And from a parent's perspective, it's so hard because you want your loved one to have a life that's worthwhile and to do something good with their time on this earth. And sometimes parents will start off with a course of treatment and they'll have an expectation, that this is going to fix my loved one. And sometimes early on, you might get that effect. And sometimes early on, all you've done is you've started to just plant a seed for that individual that might have future reoccurrences, to just have in the back of their mind that when things get bad, they know where to go. They know where to go.
Now, earlier when I asked you a question, you mentioned that it can affect different people differently because everybody's different. Some people become more dependent on it. When you first started using it, did you ever think in your wildest dreams that you would become dependent on it and move to other drugs?
No, not at all. I had no clue the ride it was going to take me on. Absolutely no clue. I thought I was just being a normal teenager. Ironically, a lot of my peers that weren't going down that road, a lot of my teachers, a lot of my coaches, a lot of people in my life that were observing me from a distance, would tell you that it was very evident to them, that I was making a turn for the worst. I could not see it. Part of that maybe was I didn't want to see it. At that time it might have been enjoyable, but I was absolutely blind to where it was going to take me.
Do you solely blame marijuana for leading you into other drugs?
No.
You don't?
No, I blame my own actions. I had to, and that's just what works for me. I'm a big believer of personal accountability these days. And at the end of the day, I've never went throughout the course of my life without with a lack of good guidance. I've had good guidance all around me. So the moment at age 29 when I took responsibility that I was where I was at because of my own actions, was the start of something new for me.
So, did you view it as, back then, you mentioned that you thought it was just something normal, you were just being a teenager, and you mentioned that it was like a neighborhood thing, that it was just a normal thing. Mm-hmm. Did other people that you were with go down this path like you?
Absolutely, and I could probably count on 4 sets of hands, people that are not with us today.
Why do you think that it's so hard to quit using marijuana?
Well, I really think that for a lot of us, that have went down that path, it gets to a point where it's a spiritual dilemma, and that's going to require a spiritual solution. And unfortunately, one of the things that's very hard to produce in an individual is hope. Hope, I think, is the forgotten metric in addiction, to be able to inspire people that your life is where it's at now, and it's not good, but there's an opportunity, and it is possible to get on the other side of this and live a happy, joyful, and fruitful life.
Were you worried at the time of legal troubles that could happen to you from using marijuana?
Yeah, and I actually experienced some. I don't want to minimize, my behaviors at that time. I did, get quite a handful of, misdemeanor offenses, and at an early age was introduced to the system. But that's the baffling thing. One that does not struggle with addiction, could look at my situation from the outside in and say, you're getting arrested. You know what I mean? You're having to spend nights in jail. You're having to pay fines. You should stop. And for someone with that mindset, my only thought was of self. How can I get the next one? How can I smoke the next joint? How can I get the next drug? And just absolutely incapable of viewing the world in any other manner but that.
So if legal troubles weren't enough at the time to convince you to stop, what do you think was finally the breaking point where you realized that you need to get clean and get your life together?
Oh, yeah, great question. As I said, the past 7 years of my addiction were, much harder substances. And, I had multiple treatment attempts through the latter part of my 20s. And I worked in the Carpenters Union out of West Virginia, and was struggling, and I landed in hopefully my last treatment center at age 29 in South Florida, and I had been worse off legally, I had been worse off physically. I had this moment where this realization came over my life. I was 29 years old, and it was just like this thing kept playing in my brain. It's like, you're 29 years old and you get one chance at life. You get one chance at life. You haven't done much in the positive manner the past decade and a half. You lost a college athletic scholarship 2 years into it. You struggled in the military. You somehow managed to get a degree. But in addition to that, you've hurt everybody you've come in contact with. So that realization, coupled with the fact that I had pushed everyone that cared about me away, and I was 29 years old, lonely, that scared me. I didn't want to go through this world alone. I didn't want to go through this world without having a good relationship at some point with my parents, with my sister. I wanted to have a family, which I do now. I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. I wanted to, be part of the solution in my community, and I have an opportunity to do that now. So the loneliness and, just the awakening that I was, going to go through this world and do nothing scared me.
So you would say it was more of a personal reflection that inspired you to stop. It wasn't really anybody else, just you thinking about your life. And
yeah. The unfortunate thing, Aidan, is, people that struggle with addiction all have a different threshold for whether it's physical pain or emotional pain or spiritual pain. And I'd hit my breaking point.
Many people don't understand addiction. And was there anybody in your family that struggled with addiction that introduced you to that, or was it completely random?
No, I can't really say that anybody in my family introduced me to addiction. I did have an aunt, my father's sister, that was a product of pill mills and did overdose years ago. We found her dead in her sleep. I've had various, my dad's brothers have had bouts with alcoholism, and one of his brothers is sober now and been sober for 2 decades. So a lot of different debate on whether this is a genetic thing or acquired through bad decisions. I don't have the answer. I do know that addiction has touched my family in a lot of different ways.
If you could go back to yourself and before, when you were 13 years old, what would you tell yourself to warn for the future?
Fantastic question. I've often thought about that. I would definitely tell myself that the life of the party and gaining acceptance from any other person is meaningless. I would definitely encourage myself to follow my dreams and stay on the path of education and stick with the winners. And that's something that I had a real hard time doing. And something that ran my middle school and high school life was what do people think about me? And the irony is what I learned almost 2 decades later is, if I just do the right thing for the right reason, treat people good, be kind, be helpful, the people that matter will be around.
Although marijuana, it may have held you back from reaching what your goals were, now that you are where you are, do you think that in a way it could have benefited your mindset of thinking about what's really important?
Well, I definitely, I'll word it this way. I definitely didn't grow up aspiring to get into the things that I did. I will tell you that where I'm at today is my struggles in life have become my greatest asset. So I can't necessarily say that everything that's happened up to this point has been bad. Some of the things that are in my life currently have given me an opportunity to take some of the bad things that I've done in my life and some of the consequences and turn them into just a platform to maybe affect change in one person here and there. I definitely would encourage people not to take that path, because unfortunately some people don't get an opportunity to turn their troubles into an asset. You know, they get buried in the ground.
Now, being an interventionalist, do you have people come in that remind you of where you were when you were a kid?
Oh, of course. You know, I mean, speaking with families and people affected with addiction, it's a big reminder. You know, and it's part of my healing too. You know, and reminder. You know that, you've made some progress. You know, in almost the past decade, but don't fall victim to the fact that you can't go back there with one wrong decision. So I try to remain grateful. I try to remain helpful, and probably the best thing that I can do with my life today is the giving of my time.
So for our final question, what overall advice would you give to students today that are struggling with maybe the same problem that you had when you were a kid?
I would encourage students to listen to your parents. It's very cliche. I would encourage students to not fall victim to the thought that it won't happen to you. I've seen the best people, just 10 years from some simple experimentation under a bridge. It will happen to you. And don't underestimate the power of addiction. It's bigger than you.
Well, it looks like that'll be all the time that we have today. I'd like to thank you very much, Mr. Burkheimer,
Thank you.
for sharing all of your informational, personal, and your experiences. It's been a pleasure having you on the show. I'm Aidan Dowdall, and thank you for tuning in to Watch the Edge.